One or two people have been asking me about books, and I would just suggest, if you don't know them, the very useful, I think, are the encyclopedias. I mean, the Encyclopedia of Islam, which was only recently finished. Any subject you look it up by top scholars, including some quite broad subjects, some long extended essays. Also, there is an encyclopedia of, I think it's Islamic philosophy, edited by an Iranian, whose name I forget, and Lehman, L-E-A-M-A-N, and the same Oliver Lehman wrote a very interesting book some years ago now on, I think it's on Islamic philosophy, which is about the medieval material, which actually, he told me, an Iranian once met him and said, oh, your book is on all our reading lists, and I think it's been sort of pirated into Persian. So it's on the reading lists of the madrasas in Iran today, I believe.
Could you comment on the distinction between spiritual and political?
Yes.
As you indicated, at the initial phase of the emergence of Islam, we see.
I can't hear him at all. I'll have to come up. Oh God, sorry.
I'll repeat the question.
Okay, I'll try to speak up.
Okay.
Initially, we see there's a embodiment, if that's the right word to say, of political and spiritual. However, today we see amongst the Muslim, there is a tendency of either being spiritual or being political.
Right.
And there's a big debates about spirituality and being political, i.e. these are two different things.
Yeah.
These are two different issues. So I was wondering, how does it correspond with the early phase of Islam, where we see this embodiment of political and spirituality? So I'd like your comment on this. The second point is, as you said, there's two things that's been emphasized, which is one, obedience, and the second, you quote a hadith which states that speaking out against injustice is one of the very central thesis. But where does obedience ends, and where's the boundary lies between obedience and speaking out against injustice, which kind of borders anarchy or fitna, whatever term you want to use, which you said is worse than 100 years. One day of peace or one day of law and order is better than 100 years of anarchy, or other way around, actually. So could you comment on those points, please?
Okay, so two questions.
Yeah, it's okay. I think I've got them, but if I misunderstand it, correct me. Well, the first one is about the distinction between the political and the spiritual. This is obviously a huge topic, and it goes right through religious history, both of Islam and every well, certainly Christianity anyway, the relationship between the spiritual and the political. And probably, as you all know, I mean, many Muslims over the centuries have gone for a purely spiritual path. I mean, some of the people I've mentioned, and most notably, for some of the time, Sufis, but not all the time, because, suddenly Sufis became extremely political, and suddenly other Muslims went back to the political. I think usually because there was some crisis in society and government, people said, things are terrible. They could be better. Surely they could be better. There must be a solution. Where do we find the solution? Oh, in the religion. So the religion gives us the right to do something about this, and so they rise up, and throughout the dynasty, and put in a new dynasty, and to that extent become political. Then the new dynasty are nice chaps, or appear to be, and so they say, okay, we'll sort things out. You go back to the mosque and say your prayers, and we'll look after. And so there becomes quietism once again. That sort of thing tends to happen. But now, well, I know now. I mean, this is just hugely debated, and we'll come to this certainly when looking at Islam today. Where are the limits of obedience? Well, I mean, this is a big issue, I think, with early Islamic political thought, that very little is written down, very little is defined. Everything is left to the individual judgment, to the religious sensibility of the individual, so that people don't say what are the limits to obedience, except saying that you should speak out against injustice, and that could mean all kinds of things. So I suppose my point there is that although it claimed to be political, early and medieval Islam didn't actually say very much about how this was to be implemented.
Okay, I just wanted to ask about during the Umayyads, when Muawiyah had nominated Yazid, what kind of theological basis or political thought would he have drawn on to do that? Because considering previously to that, the rightly guided caliphs there was no hereditary aspect to it. And the second thing you mentioned was, also the second question I have is that you said Sunni and Shia don't mean the same today as they did in the early few centuries of Islam. So for instance, we know that one of the founders of one of the Sunni schools, Abu Hanifa, he was a supporter of the Alawites, or the people descended from Ali, to their claim to be, or to have have a position of the caliphate. I just wanted to maybe if you can expand on this a little bit.
Yeah, okay. Well, about the Umayyads, yes. I think it was really a question of perceived necessity, that the fear of disorder was such, and the actuality of disorder and rebellion and civil war was such, that they, I mean, Al-Muawiyah was a strong man who founded the dynasty and asserted his power, and people said that you should obey his successors by kinship. Well, I don't think they gave a reasoned argument exactly, except to say that the caliph embodies all sides of very flowery language, rather in the Persian mode, but with a using Quranic terms. And I mean, he's the shepherd of the people. He rains down water from heaven, and he's a wonderful guy, and of course in the very early days, as you maybe know, there was a strong claim that the caliph didn't just represent the prophet, he represented God. And Patricia Crone wrote a wonderful book called God's Deputy, in which she discusses this. And this view was of course rejected as being far too grandiose, and the only person who could be said to have represented God was the prophet, and what he did. So that just shows how they sort of tried to glorify their status. So I don't think it was justified logically, but in terms of sentiment. But there were lots of rebellions, so it didn't really work. And after less than 100 years, the Abbasids came along and threw them out. And they claimed a much more, I think, successful ideology, which concerned kinship with the prophet, and then they supported, to a certain extent, the development of Greek philosophy, because they thought this might bolster their claims. But that didn't last all that long. The other question was about Sunni and Shia. Yes, well, I'm afraid I don't know about Abu Hanifa, but I mean, what I meant by that was simply that there were lots of people, Shia, as you know, just means a party, people who cut themselves off. And I think it was probably a term of abuse at first. and then they just adopted it, and they didn't accept the ruling caliph from the very beginning, practically. And there were many different sects amongst these who didn't accept, and it was only later that they became a more unified group, and then they became Seveners or Twelvers, Ismailis or Imamis. And the Sunni, yes, well, it wasn't so clearly defined. I don't think they called themselves that exactly, but they were just the majority, the majority community.
Perhaps this is more of a comment than a question, but you rightly said that the Quran and the Hadith didn't explain how someone was to succeed or come to power. Perhaps it's a strength or you might see as a weakness that the point is not how someone comes to power, but when they are in power, the Hadith demonstrates how they should act. So who is not important, but it's the how they act. And in Islamic understanding, the Quran describes how humans should act in all societies, in all times. And of course, how someone is elected or comes to power all across the world, there's been so many different forms. So prescribing one method would preclude all the other methods which may perhaps be valid in all those circumstances. And secondly, you mentioned about the patrimonial monarchy, which is a great description. And I would just like to say that that method isn't necessary. The implication was that was an Islamic method of power or succession of power. But I would suggest that the people were just reverting to their previous pre-Islamic Arabic culture of how to do things. When there's a vacuum, they went back to their old ways.
Yes, I didn't mean to suggest it was Islamic. You're absolutely right. Patrimony was a completely, if you like, alien thing, which they simply adopted because it was what was around. The other question, sorry, just remind me what it was.
It's the how you
act. Oh, yes, the
not
how.
the
Yeah,
who.
well, yes, I think that's a very good point. And I mean, I would suggest that today, one of the characteristics of Islamic political thought today, in contrast to the so-called Western, the Western tends to emphasize procedures, elections, constitution. I mean, the Islamic tends to emphasize more the character of the ruler. And especially you find amongst the so-called fundamentalists that they say it doesn't really matter, rather what you've just said, how they come to power. What matters is how they are at the moment. I mean, I personally think there's something in both, and that you can't take one without the other. This is quite a good example. And there is now a big school of philosophy called virtue ethics, which is saying that it isn't just a matter of the rules and the principles, it's a matter of the individual character, which is important in ethics as defining the good person. Although you could say the same about the ruler, I agree.
Can I just comment back on that? In that, I recall Paddy Ashdown saying that one of his regrets was that in the former Yugoslavia, his understanding was that to invoke democracy, you had to have elections.
Yes.
And they ended up having many elections.
Yes, yes.
And that's one of his great regrets, was that he went down the road of procedure
Right.
Too quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we'll take it from the bottom there. And then so
So I guess just following on from that point, I'm just
Sorry, yes.
following on from the point that was just made, I guess I'm really interested in what your thoughts are on the notion that in Islam, it's one of the religious aspects of leadership is that it's sort of, I don't know if it's frowned upon to put yourself forward as a leader.
It's what, sorry?
Frowned upon. Well, it's not actively encouraged to put yourself forward as a leader.
Ah, right.
In
yes.
terms of sort of leadership
Yes.
authority. And I wonder if one of the problems that was, with the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the early caliphate, as to whether, there was a lot of, people didn't really feel comfortable
Right.
putting
right.
themselves forward in a sort of, not in an assertive way.
Yeah.
And I guess perhaps maybe there was implied leadership through the fact that maybe the Prophet sort of, peace be upon him, described Abu Bakr as the best of men apart from the prophets, and the fact that he loved him the most and all those sorts of things. So I just wonder how much is the spiritual sort of pulling back from, your assertiveness and sort
Yes.
of,
Well, I think that's an extremely interesting question. I'm afraid I don't know. I don't think people really know. There may have been something of that. Certainly the first, Abu Bakr, didn't, as far as I understand, put himself forward at all. The second, whose name I'm now going to forget, but I do actually know it. Sorry?
Omar.
Yeah, Omar, who did most of the conquest, I think. I've no idea whether he put himself forward, but he was generally regarded as quite a reasonable guy. Uthman, I think often it was family disputes and family connections, and people said, we want to have one of our section in power, and it was very much, I think, to do with kinship disputes, and of course that was highly disputed, and he was assassinated. Ali perhaps didn't know. Maybe now that would be a case in point. I don't think people know really too much about it, but as it's recorded, he appears somebody who didn't put himself forward because he had a strong claim. Perhaps that was why he was disliked, because they thought he would be too powerful. I don't know, but anyway, it was only after the assassination of Uthman that he was then elected, so he would be a case in point. So there probably is that element, yes. Mm.
So I just wanted to come back on the point about does it matter how, as long as the ethics of the person who's ruling after they come into power is good. So I think part of the problem is that if the process of how someone becomes a ruler is not clear and seen as fair by the majority of the people being ruled, that would cause a lot of tension in the society, and part of the large number of people who didn't want this person to become ruler will always be opposing whatever the person tries to do, whatever kind of policies that they have, will always be looking in a negative light about whatever sort of forecasts or propositions this person have. So I do think it is quite important about how it happens, because it has a strong bearing on what happens afterwards, and how the person's actions and thoughts and propositions and proposals are viewed by the large percentage of society.
Yeah. Mm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Good morning. First, I'd like to thank you for coming on behalf of everyone. Thank you for coming here today. I follow traditional Islamic scholarship, and my understanding of initially Sunni Islam was there was a split between political authority, and the Sunnis accepted the political authority of Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and they also accepted there was a spiritual authority. The spiritual authority lay with Imam Ali and the followers and his Ahl Bayt, the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Certainly that was what would happen early on, from my understanding in early Islam. The great grandson, for example, of the Prophet the great grandson, Imam Baqir alayhi salam, mentioned that there was inner understanding of the Quran, esoteric meaning, etc. And certainly in early Islam there was this clear divide, and we actually believe, my understanding from what I've spoken to scholars, Islamic scholars, is that Sunnis believe the Shia Imams were actually Sunni. We actually accept them as our Imams, because but we believe that unfortunately, due to political reasons, when the family of the Prophet ﷺ, Ahl Bayt, became increasingly popular, they then became a threat to the political authority. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, basically, unfortunately, the systematic eradication of by the political authority of this respect a love for Ahl Bayt, which is the family of the Prophet ﷺ, and perhaps now we're at a place where Sunnis really don't understand how important Ahl Bayt are. And unfortunately, I mean, in the subcontinent where I come from, we certainly have a great respect for Sayyids and Shahs and people like that. And I just wanted to get your understanding of where, from your research, have you found that things have changed? The Ahl Bayt within Sunni Islam have been eradicated due to a threat posed to the political authority. Thank you.
I think from the Umayyads onwards, spiritual authority basically went to the ulama. So there was a division there between the ruling, the ruler, the political and military ruler, who was the caliph, and the ulama, and so they, grassroots, if you like, had the allegiance of people in matters of behavior, and so they did develop a definite split between political and religious authority, which various people at various times tried to bridge, as we shall see. This is, I think, a recurring theme, and of course it's still going on today with the whole notion of political Islam, and to what extent to be effective in the religious field you have to hold political power. Sorry, was there something else in your question I've missed?
Essentially, I wanted to know, from your research, do you find that the political authority, like you just mentioned, have in a way eradicated the spiritual authority within Islam? Because Sunnis actually traditionally believed in the spiritual authority of the Imams, but somehow it's been lost over the years, and neo-political movements have capitalized. Now we're at a point where Ahl Bayt, the family of the Prophet ﷺ, I'm a Sunni, is not respected like it used to be.
The family of who?
The Prophet ﷺ.
Of the Prophet?
Yes.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Well, I'm not sure really is the answer, but my only thought is that spiritual authority, they couldn't eradicate it altogether. It went to other people, for example, Sufi leaders, people who showed themselves to be pious, and various people, and charismatic leaders might spring up, like the Safavids in Iran much later, and like people today, charismatic leaders spring up, claiming some sort of direct line to the deity, perhaps, or new insight which makes them valid, etc. I mean, all I can say is that there was a separation between political and spiritual power. Spiritual power spiritual respect, if you like, remained, but in different people. And I suppose the political authorities would accept that so long as it wasn't a threat to them, basically.
Firstly, thank you for coming, Professor Black. My question is regarding a narration known amongst the Muslims,
yes,
that there will be a period of good justice rule, then there will come a period of monarchy, then there will become a period of tyranny, and a return back to a just rule. It's a common hadith known amongst the Muslims.
Right.
How much has this played in your research regarding political thought throughout the history of the nation, Muslim nation?
Yeah.
Because, like I say, a lot of people have relied upon this to say this was just the state of things that were going to happen.
Yeah.
Did this narration provide any justification for the rules in the past?
Well, I think it's extremely difficult to know what it was like in the very early years as to what extent it was just, but presumably people thought it was okay because they supported it. I mean, in the time of the Prophet and immediately afterwards, the Arab armies must have thought it was great, because the reason they did their conquest was because they had such conviction, unlike most of the people they were fighting, who were, as it were, mercenaries, you see. So there is that. Certainly very strong evidence of decline is tyranny, and the belief in a future just society keeps recurring, I think. Yes. I think sometimes you find this in an individual dynasty, that it starts off being a great improvement on what went before and then declines. And actually, your quotation of the hadith reminds me of Ibn Khaldun, in a way, who has this wonderful theory of history, which is that a new group, and in a way he's trying to understand the development of Islam when he writes this, I think. A new group, sort of inspired, has what he calls asabiyya, togetherness, great group feeling, ousts the old rule, takes over the cities, takes over the mainstream civilization, and then in 3 generations it becomes corrupt. And then it's ousted by another one. That's Ibn Khaldun's theory of history, for which there is a lot of, you know, I mean, if you look at Islamic dynasties, they often do last about 3 generations. So.
When I look at the divisions within the Ummah from early days, I tend to describe it as a tendency towards self-righteous exclusionism. Even if one looks at the history to date, you know, early period and colonialism and the geographical spread, Muslims have so much in common, much more common than what divides them. And it frustrates me to think that nobody emphasizes the common elements even today. And there's elements who tend to sort of emphasize what divides them, what differences are, which tend to be mostly of political nature and so on. With the kind of discussion we are having and reawakening even in the West and interest in Islam and globally, do you see any signs of people appreciating the futility of these divisions and subscribing to them? Do you see the Muslims coming together on a common platform as a civilization and moving forward rather than looking backwards towards disunity?
Well, yes, I think this is an undercurrent throughout Islamic history, actually, that to what extent it's articulated, I can't put chapter and verse, but I mean, certainly the way Muslims behave is, it seems to me, throughout history, very much based upon the supposition that they are the people. And, well, you'll be familiar with this, I don't know if it's a hadith or a practice anyway, that you never support a non-Muslim against a Muslim. At least that's pretty widely thought and said. So there would have to be a very strong reason for doing so. So that you stick together. So I think it's an undercurrent, but it doesn't always bring about unity. No, that's true. But I think the idea that the people should be one is a very, very strong force and assumption.
Yeah, my question was within the Muslim Ummah, and also I tend to look at these, what appears to be absolute, in the context of the situation that the Ummah or individuals face. You have to, there are some obviously defined as a matter of belief and rituals that one performs that I regard them as non-negotiable.
Yes.
But beyond that, you know, societies change.
Oh, you mean that you can accept differences?
And they are examined
without
without unhinging oneself from a belief system and so on. So I personally don't.
Yeah, now that I think is fascinating, because I think there is a tendency, and I mean you find it amongst Christians too, probably just about the same, but there is a tendency amongst Muslims to insist that their way is right and that somebody else is not. And I think this is based upon this kind of individualism, if you like, the belief that the individual, to put it crudely, has a hotline to God, or some individuals think they have, and other individuals can easily believe that they have. I don't mean every individual thinks this, but it's a claim that can be made. I have the right interpretation, or something like that. But there are counter movements when people, and I'm just thinking of the Seljuk dynasty, Nizam al-Mulk, who definitely wanted all to come together, and he built a university in Baghdad where all the 4 law schools were together, and the Shia as well, and he wanted to bring them all together. And that was a very positive step and a very added greatly to political power, I think. So there have been moves in that direction. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's...
You mentioned the Wahhabis adopted Ibn Taymiyyah's concepts, ideas. Did you mean primarily from point of view of politics, or do you know? Would you say it was primarily from other aspects of creed and practices?
I don't know that much about the Wahhabi movement, but what I've understood, and I think it's clear, is that they did believe, as is clear they practice at this moment, a unity between religious and political duties. They clearly see the state, i.e. the Wahhabi family, I'm sorry, the, what do they call it, the Saudi family, as having both religious and political authority. As far as I can see, they do. And also, of course, they make a big thing of enforcing religious norms, which they see as probably their primary duty. Certainly they see themselves as, I'm sure they don't call themselves caliph, but they behave like that. That's what I meant. Plus, of course, the pretty rigid enforcement of the Hanbali legal system, as far as I can see. That's what I think it means.
Okay, thank you.
And of course, that's pretty important for politics in the world today, since we know what comes out of that.
I just wanted to ask if you have a view on the word jihad, which you've pretty much translated all through as holy war.
Yes.
And whether in fact that's perhaps an over-restrictive translation,
yeah.
since its meaning is probably wider than that, and open to misinterpretation, perhaps, if it's solely transmitted as
sure.
holy war.
Yes, I mean, it is said, as far as I know, by jurists or by religious thinkers, that the greater jihad is personal prayer and virtue, and the lesser jihad is what we call holy war. But although that is said by the jurists, I mean, I do find throughout this period that jihad is insisted upon as a religious duty and as very important. Now, of course, who carries it out? I mean, individual Muslims on the whole don't carry it out. It's carried out by the state, often by hiring mercenaries or whoever will perform it, you know. But as you probably know, I mean, it's a religious duty in the sense that somebody has to fulfill it, and providing somebody is fulfilling it, you don't have to. It's not like prayer, which everybody has to.
The synergy between the spiritual and temporal realms within Islam, you said that Ibn Taymiyyah brought it back into focus and gave it a much more emphasis. How do you see that synergy between the spiritual and temporal working within other civilizations at the same time?
Very good question, yes. I mean, the history of Eastern Christianity under the Byzantine Empire, it was pretty complete. The emperor was regarded as the representative of Christ. I mean, he didn't have complete power over religious, certainly he didn't have any power over religious teaching, but I think he could pretty much decide who held high religious office. And that, of course, was carried on in Russia, where the Tsar precisely held religious and political authority, and Peter the Great established, what was it called, the Holy Synod, which was a group of people who specifically controlled religion in the Russian Empire and was subject to the Tsar. So it was there in Western Europe, very much so, though it caused much more dispute, and if you like, was more creative. But kings were generally regarded as being, in some sense, sacred. King by the grace of God. Well, our queen, I think, is still called queen by the grace of God. Their office was supreme, and although there was a division between the political officials, the king and the political officials on the one hand, and the clergy on the other, there was a great deal of synergy between them. Yes.
Just as a follow-up, I mean, how much do you think, the question is raised, how much was Ibn Taymiyyah's writings and thoughts then influenced by the world that he saw around him, in the sense that other people were attempting the same type of synergy?
Well, I think it was a response to circumstances, in particular the fall of the caliphate, a very intelligent response. But the other, his great contemporary, a man called Ibn Jama'ah, who was completely the opposite. He was an advocate of complete subservience to the state on the part of the ulama, etc. And the state here meant the Mamluks, who were the major Muslim power at the time, based in Egypt. And Ibn Jama'ah is always quoted by modern reformers as being the classic example of the corrupt decadence to which Muslim political thought, if you like, had sunk in the worst periods of despotism. So other people thought differently.
Okay. Yes, I've got just a couple of points. First of all, with regard to the point taken up by the gentleman just right there about holy war, I think the term is very problematic, because regardless of the other points which he raised about whether it's broader or less so, everything one does as a Muslim has to be according to a religious code. One doesn't say holy banking or holy education, you know. But why does one say it when it comes to this? I don't think it should apply. Jihad is struggling, it's striving, it's fighting, and there is no such thing as a holy war. You know, and it's never claimed to be that in Islam. The term, if you translate it back to Arabic, would be harb muqaddasa. It never comes up in the Quran, it never comes up in the Sunnah, it never comes up in the discussions of the jurists. There is no such thing. So I think that's one thing that it really needs to be dropped from the literature when talking about this kind of thing.
Well, I would just say that, I mean, I think this is what rulers were supposed to do. The Ottomans certainly, which were the only Muslim state at the time which was really expanding, you know, conquered the whole of Anatolia and then Byzantium itself, and then they went on and on into Eastern Europe until they reached Hungary. So I mean, they were conducting jihad without any question, in a military sense.
No doubt, that's not my issue. My issue is that it's absolutely a religious duty to conduct the military campaign. However, that doesn't make it holy, because
well, I think they thought it was. They thought it was. But if I may just quote an example of the other point which came up earlier, that I saw a very interesting program about Mahatma Gandhi, in which it said that during his time in South Africa he met various Muslim groups, and there he learned the concept of jihad, which he took on board. And by that he obviously meant struggle for justice, because as you well know, Gandhi was a complete pacifist, but he endorsed the notion of jihad in that other sense.
You spoke briefly about the Mongol invasion.
Yes.
But at the same time of Al-Mawardi and Ibn Taymiyyah, you had the Crusades going on.
Ah, well, I didn't mention them.
And just for example, in the 20th century, we had this notion during the First and Second World Wars in Europe.
Yes.
The concepts of nationalism,
yes.
of people pulling together.
Yes.
I mean, in the World Wars, it was nationalism of
yes.
industry, but I can understand that would have been one of the influences on these and other people at that time of looking at their government and the combination of government and religion.
Well, I would like to make it clear that the concept of, I'll call it holy war, it's just a phrase, war in the name of God, if you like.
How about just war? Because it was Thomas.
No, well, it's more than just war, it's war in the name of God. I mean, this goes back to the Old Testament. It's the basis of practically of the original Jewish belief, that they had the right to go and conquer the land of Israel, drive out the Canaanites, kill them if necessary, you know, all the rest of it. This was a basic thing. If you read any account of the history, the early history, that was what they did. They thought it was right. Now the Christians, we know that they were totally non-violent in their origins. They were even forbidden to serve in the army. They didn't offer resistance. Their martyrs were people who didn't resist, who were simply killed. But when they gained political power in the 5th, 6th centuries before the rise of Islam, they began advocating what they called holy war. I'm not sure if they used that word, but they meant it anyway, against pagans, right? And you find it even before the rise of Islam. And then you find Charlemagne, the emperor, in about 800, going around killing Saxons if they won't be converted to Christianity. So that's, if you like, a crusade. And then you get the Crusades, which are certainly advocated as a holy war, very much so, very much so. So yes, I mean, it's not just a Muslim idea. I'm trying to sort of accept that very strongly. Well, I agree. They were extremely. I mean, to begin with, the Crusades weren't that significant for the Muslim world because they only involved a small area. It just so happened that the Palestine in that area at the time was in a bit of a chaos, and that's why the First Crusade found it relatively easy to conquer Jerusalem, etc. At first, yeah, but I mean, what the influence they had on Muslim thought, is that what you're referring to? Yeah, I mean, they certainly, I don't think they changed Muslim thought particularly, I wouldn't say. And I mean, let us face it, they went on trading, you know, I mean, and perhaps the main contact between East and West all through was not the war, but the Italian merchants who came and traded with the ports in the Levant, you know, and there was a huge amount of commerce going on.
I think the Crusades put Islam on the defensive. It was a hugely aggressive move against not only Muslims but Jews as well.
Oh yes,
if you
I
look
agree.
at the history of southern Spain, of Andalusia,
yes, absolutely.
There's whole-scale
yes.
bloodshed
oh,
and
yes.
intolerance
yes.
that went on around that time. So it's hardly unusual to expect some sort of defensive action.
Oh, I agree.
in
Yes,
response
entirely.
to that. I mean, around. I'm not sure about my time scales, but around that sort of time.
Yeah.
If you look at the impact that the Crusades had, well, not the Crusades as such, but the Spanish
yeah.
Catholics on
yeah.
regions as far away as Central South America.
Sure.
And the level of bloodshed is absolutely
oh, yeah.
unbelievable, and yet I'm getting this impression from the way you talk that somehow you're equating Islam with violence, and also as sort of slightly irrational beings, in that they followed whoever was put in charge, and it's never been the case. I think a lot of Islamic conversion happened through a respect for the leader.
Yeah.
Because the Prophet Muhammad, it's very unlikely that he would have managed to get that sort of following. He certainly didn't do it by the sword.
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree.
It was based on ideas and respect amongst the community. And in that way, I think Islam has, it's far more democratic than the Western concept of democracy. I think we have to be a bit more open to the idea of democracy and Muslims as general.
Well, it's certainly true. You know, Ibn Taymiyyah's stuff could be seen in that light. I agree. You know, and certainly they thought that driving out the Crusaders was a form of holy war. Yes, yes. And I mean, I broadly accept what you're saying. Yeah.
Thank you for your speech. I think there's a recent kind of emergence in modern society, particularly with a lot of Muslims, and I think maybe something that seems to be quite prevalent.
Sorry?
There's a kind of an attitude amongst many Muslims that I kind of see, and I wanted to get your perspective on, which I think is interesting, is that much of the Islamic thought in many ways has already been written, and as opposed to having to rethink things, it's often we have to revive things or renovate things in the past. And one of the things you finished on just now is that philosophy has died out, and I guess kind of a point as opposed to a question or kind of a thought. Is it the case that it's necessarily died out, or is it the question that it's already been written and summarized, and kind of Ghazali and these other philosophers of the past have kind of covered everything that needs to be that is needed within Islamic thought, such that there is no need for new people to emerge and develop their own forms of philosophy?
That I can't answer. You have to answer that.
Professor, there are some Muslims who tend to blame Al-Ghazali for the lack of engagement on the part of the Muslim worldwide with science and development of technology and innovation and all that. I used to be one of them until I looked at it closely. I'm not a historian. My background is in industry and research and development and licensing and commercial and all that, and management. Until I looked at it closely, I found that that was really not a fair assessment of the situation. Because that happened a long time ago. And the people who do, if you look at the Western world, who does research in science and technology and all that, it started with military governments or the institutions set up purposely for that job, and then the universities and so on. And the spin-offs is not in the hands of religious people or whatever. So in the Muslim world, the power has been in the hands of whoever, and they are excluded from this criticism or debate. It's always aimed at some people like Ghazali or that philosophical train of thought. And even I have direct experience in the Middle East and elsewhere, talking to people, very senior decision makers, and you don't get the impression that they don't want to do science or technology because for religious reasons. Do you agree with me that it's an escapism on the part of Muslims who feel, for lifestyle reasons, embarrassed or whatever because of the relative lack of development in the Muslim world, and tend to blame Islam for everything else? Okay. And my second question is, I think briefly that you referred to Ibn Khaldun's comment about politicians not understanding the world around them or philosophers or something. Is that true for our politicians as well?
No, philosophers.
No, yeah. Is that what you said?
He said philosophers didn't understand.
Politicians didn't understand philosophy and
no, he didn't say that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No.
What did you say?
Philosophers didn't know anything about practical politics.
Okay.
Which I think is true.
Not the other
largely.
way around. Okay.
Not always, but.
Okay. Well, can I turn it around and ask you whether you think our current politicians who speak on the basis of briefs they are fed with, and the narrative and the phraseology just invented to, reductionism.
Yeah. Oh God, yes.
Do you think they understand?
Well,
do you think taxpayers' money causing more chaos and disharmony?
Well, I think our present politicians tend all to be rhetoricians. In fact, that's been their profession. They're professional. What's the word? Consultants. Oh God, these people who in advertising. I mean, Cameron's background is advertising, or something. Or, I can't remember what it is. It's something like that. I mean, they're all. There does tend. However, Lady Honora O'Neill, one of the greatest living British philosophers, has just been made chair of some very important. I don't know what it is. I just read it in the paper. Some very important committee or commission. And John Rawls, the great writer on justice, his works have deeply influenced all leftist parties, like the British Labour Party. His attempt to reconcile freedom and equality. So that's been very important, I would say.
And the first question.
Sorry, it was. No, go on. What was it?
It's better than me explaining. No, whether the can I say?
Oh, Al-Ghazali was blamed for. Yeah, okay.
He can still be blamed after so many centuries.
Well,
because he won the basis of argument.
Yeah, I would agree basically with what you're saying, and I would just like to draw a little parallel with Europe or comparison with Europe here, because you rightly said, I think what made a difference for Europe was the institution of the university, which provided the intellectuals with a community which protected them. And remarkably, the papacy was very strong in supporting universities because, well, various reasons, but it was. but there's a famous charter, the first charter of Paris University in 12 something. They had written to the Pope saying, could you please give us a charter? And he wrote back this wonderful reply, you don't need me to validate you, but in case you do, I do it. That was his reply. So they supported the universities. The universities had a legal existence, which was extremely important. But then I would also say that Europe, too, very nearly suffered a demise of philosophy. After this guy, William of Ockham, there was nothing much. Philosophy went into, well, but the universities were still there, and I think perhaps the Reformation reignited it. And indeed, if you look at Spain and Italy, pretty much it did die out with the Counter-Reformation.
I just want to make some comments on Ghazali and would appreciate if you have anything to say about this as well. I think the thing about the Ghazali is people like to interpret him what kind of fits their worldview. So for example, if you have a spiritual inclination, people tend to just look at the latter parts of his life where he kind of really focused and disengaged from his scholarship. Whereas I can say the same thing if you look at his early part of his life. I mean, during my undergraduate years, I remember reading parts of his Objective of Philosophers. I mean, I didn't read the whole book, I just read some chapters. It's very difficult to see that this is being written by a Muslim theologian. It sounds like any ordinary philosopher has just written a book on philosophy. So, I mean, what fascinates me, personally speaking, about Ghazali is the fact that he mastered the so-called non-Islamic sciences, i.e. the philosophy, in the way understood in the Western political thought, Plato, Aristotelian traditions, and how he managed to sort of interpret these from a contemporary perspective, from an Islamic perspective, for his time, in relating these ideas in terms of Muslim creed, Muslim belief, which I personally think is sort of fundamentally required in contemporary period for us. I mean, we have different challenges and we live in a different time. And Ghazali lived 1,000 years ago. During his time, the challenge was philosophy. Today, I personally think for Muslims, challenge is more like, you know, the public sphere and the private sphere, separation of religion, the ideas of secularism. But what I see in terms of, you know, there is a serious lack of scholarship on the traditional scholars sort of side of coming up with analysis of these modern phenomenon, whose Ghazali did nearly 1,000 years ago. So I think, you know, there's so much we can learn from his sort of if you view Ghazali holistically rather than just pick point on his particular phase in his life. And that's my point, really.
Professor, was it not a case that these philosophers, by translating these works, some of them were seen as bordering the boundaries of heresy or ungodliness, and that's why more or less it died out rather than any other fact that generally as an ummah, as a nation, the Muslim nation find it very difficult to bring into religion something that doesn't have a godly start in the first place. And would you say that was one of the main causes for it dying out rather than the arguments with the jurists as on a personal front?
Yes, I would absolutely agree. Of course, incidentally, philosophy had died out completely in the Byzantine Empire before the rise of Islam. And in fact, in 550, the emperor exiled the remaining philosophers, and they all went to Persia, to Iran. And that's where, when the Muslims conquered Iran, they came into contact with Greek philosophy, thanks to these exiles.
You were talking about Thomas Aquinas briefly, and you seemed to say, if I understood you, that his ideas were entirely independent of similar ideas that had been developed by the Muslim philosophers.
No,
That's
I was referring to Al-Ghazali. I mean, he was influenced by Ibn Rushd.
And also Ibn Sina, in my understanding.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, indeed.
Just wanted you to expand a little bit on Al-Farabi's idea. Was it who built on the philosopher king from Plato? Because that idea seems very similar to like the Imamite
Yes.
idea, and does this has this influence, say, in Iran, the Wilayat al-Faqih model?
what?
The Wilayat al-Faqih in Iran.
Oh, right. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I think very much so. Well, it is thought that Al-Farabi was a Shiite, and it would fit, his notion of leadership would fit in with the Shiite notion of the Imamate quite well. But yes, I think these ideas became quite current. And I mean, I see the modern constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran as being the closest in the modern world to Plato's state, almost, because you have this sort of group of the top jurists who have the right to veto. That's exactly what Plato says.
Just another thing, I was just interested, you mentioned the Brethren of Purity
Yes.
group. If you just talk a little bit more
Yes,
about
well, I mean, they are very, very complex and difficult, and I don't know too much about them. The best book on them by far is by a French scholar, and it is a very, very detailed study. I think he's quite likely the only person who's really read all their works, but they were an extraordinarily interesting group. And as I say, they wrote this huge encyclopedia, and I've just read the work of this French scholar who sort of takes out certain points like the one I mentioned. But there were a lot of very original groups around at this time.
Can you call the name of the scholar?
Marquet, M-A-R-Q-U-E-T. Yves Marquet, Y is his initial, Marquet.
In light of this particular statement, for example, such as the philosopher king that Plato brings into being, and the phenomena of the traditionalists, theology, and the development of philosophy in Islam, how much of these kind of questions that, of course, the early Muslims faced from Greek philosophy and also Indian philosophy, how much of these questions that seem to be sort of rational and, let's call it, neutral, how much of them are trapped in the cultural context of their time? So, for example, Greek philosophy trapped in theatrics and rhetoric of sort of the Iliad and the questions posited, Islamic philosophy contained in the Quranic text, and Christians in the need to reconcile spirituality with the dictates of power. So how much of this, of say, Islamic philosophy, in terms of traditionalism, philosophy and theology, is actually dealing with the narrative, the underlying narrative of the origins of the philosophical questions? Do you understand me?
I think so, yes. I mean, you're talking about the extent to which philosophical works are influenced by their cultural surroundings and their historical surroundings.
And the question, not just the work, but because it seems to me the Greek philosophical questions, which are very relevant and are very universal now.
Very relevant to?
It's very relevant. I mean,
to us now, yes.
Western culture, Islamic culture,
Yeah.
is trying to deal with these questions of destiny and fate, and all the whole thing, and it's politics, of course, are trapped in a very sort of ancient Greek cultural context based on rhetoric, theatrics, and certain conception of man that's not necessarily stated. Whereas that I would say that the Islamic origin of philosophy is based on the Quran. So even if we have traditionalists and some sort of extreme traditionalists and theologians, you do have a base culture which is positing and presenting questions and answers and premises for discourse. And I would see that much of the modernism, particularly nowadays, including Wilayat al-Faqih and other conceptions, is sort of trapped in proving and disproving, but not really accepting as a base of Islamic philosophy the Quran, and then positing other questions, but presenting answers from that base and philosophizing those premises and trying to prove or disprove them in the real world. Because I think that's been pretty much sort of shown in Western philosophy, that there is a cultural base, which I feel nowadays, last 50 years or so, is often subtly denied. That there's a cultural base that's not the works of philosophy, but the cultural context of its time, 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. And the reason I ask that is therefore then Islamic philosophy or Islamic thought based on philosophy, politics, and others could be understood as rooted in its text, and anyone who wants to criticize it can of course do that, but has to accept its base as the Quran, just as there is a base of the Iliad and other texts of poetry and culture to Western philosophy.
Well, it's very difficult to answer. I mean, all I would say about the Greeks is that I think they were blessed in that their authoritative texts of the Iliad and the Odyssey, nobody believed them to be true. So they didn't involve any sort of intellectual twisting. They were regarded as role models, yes, but they were known to be stories. And I think some of the Greeks are certainly quite relevant today if you're talking about ethics and life in general. But I would tend not to say so much Plato and Aristotle, but the poets and some of the pre-Platonic philosophers, but especially the poets, the tragedians. I think they are amongst the greatest works ever written. The plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. And so I would say they do have a timeless value.
I just wanted to know, what did the philosophers in general, what was their opinion on the Umayyad rule?
On the
Umayyads, the Umayyad dynasty, and when the Abbasids took over, their reasoning for taking over, their excuses,
yes,
their justification, and the claims of certain Shi'i movements. Where do they sort of stand with all these three different perspectives on who has the right to rule? What's their sort of take? Who do they support?
I think on the whole they didn't take a stand on things like the legitimacy of Abbasids. They were very abstract. They were talking about the imamate in a sort of general and abstract way. Al-Farabi in particular, I don't think they applied it to particular dynasty or anything like that. And it's very difficult to find any hint in their writings of. This is perhaps a problem. They're very non-specific. Al-Farabi, I think in particular, their attitude towards the Iranians, I don't think they had any particular attitude. There was, of course, a great movement at this time to revive Iranian culture, which a lot of people said had been unfairly swamped by the Arabic culture. And there's a big movement to say Iranians are just as much Muslims as the Arabs, and they've got they quoted Firdausi wrote a great book of the history of the kings, Shahnameh I think it's called, and they glorified some of the old Sasanian monks as being types of ideal prince. But I don't think there was much interaction with the philosophers.
Sorry, I just had a quick question on this issue between about whether right and wrong can be
known
yes. through reason or just by revelation. So is that issue still being debated amongst Muslim thinkers
today?
Recently, contemporarily?
I honestly don't know offhand. I haven't seen it debated as such, but I think people in this room would probably know more than I do about that.
So the general view that it's only by revelation, that's the general
That is my impression, but probably people have different opinions, I should think. Certainly, I mean, if you take the Western stroke Christian world, you find obviously very different. You find still some people who think it's been revealed and some people who deny that, and
So, I mean, you mentioned this disjunction between the philosophers and the jurists, and then you introduced into that sort of their competing methodologies, and you talked about the sort of theistic subjectivism model of morality.
Yes.
Where nothing is intrinsic, and it's divine fiat effectively that determines what's right and wrong. And you contrasted to that the position of the philosophers, which was shared by the Mu'tazila, one of two perspectives, either that right and wrong are intrinsic in the deeds themselves, or they're intrinsic to our perception of things in a kind of Kantian way. So the Mu'tazila adopted that, and the Shia, who were influenced by the Mu'tazila, adopted the same perspective, and to my knowledge the Twelvers still have that sort of this rationally perceptible perspective on morality. But the interesting thing is, I believe it's sometimes misleading to make the distinction between the two parties, because, I mean, ontologically they're arguing for different positions. They're saying morality is a matter of provenance or not. But in epistemological terms, and what really matters for determining the content of right and wrong rather than just their source or their abstract nature, they're agreed that it is revelation. And I mean, this is true with the Mu'tazila as well. And there's a great example in the work of an academic called Sherman Jackson, when he looks at Mu'tazili thought. He brings forward one particular example of a guy called Qadi Abdul Jabbar, and says he justifies slavery because he said, well, it's in Revelation, therefore it's very good.
Oh yes.
So the broad point I'm making is that for me it's a superficial distinction to make, because ontologically they disagree, but epistemologically they both agree that Revelation is really the source of morality.
Right.
So that's just what I think.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think I can add anything to that at the moment.
Hi, Professor. You mentioned this idea of ebbing between spiritual and political ideas, if I understand that right, sort of over time, of leaning towards the spiritual and then towards the political. And then you mentioned about when things are going badly politically, people tend to look inwards, and the religious or the spiritual becomes more important until that develops. Do you think Islam is on, with the rise of fundamentalism, we're on that political wane, which is why we've got a rise in fundamentalism as people are looking towards spirituality?
Well, that is, of course, the $64 million question. What is the origin of fundamentalism? And many people would argue that it is quite significantly a response to poverty, unemployment, bad social conditions, I mean, people, as we know, in such social conditions, seek some remedy. They seek something better, and they very often find it in their own culture or religion or whatever it might be. Or they might find it in a new culture. I mean, the Chinese, who underwent something rather similar, including colonialism, they found it in Marxism, a new creed, a different creed, if you like. And in fact, the other thing I would say is that in Muslim majority countries like Egypt, etc., the initial reaction to colonialism was really more socialism and Marxism. I mean, Nasser, the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria, which of course still exists in name, these were supposedly nationalist, socialist parties. Now, and the language of Marxism is very hot on imperialism and the rights of the underdog, etc. And then, at least in my reading of events, 1967, the Arab-Israeli war, military defeat, total discrediting. Nasser discredited, all that stuff discredited. And so what happened is somebody said the only viable political language left was the Islamic. And that, I think, fueled the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And you find exactly the same in Iran, where there were two reactions to, as you all know, the Britain and America intervened with Mossadegh in 1954, overthrew the elected government because of the oil situation, and reintroduced the Shah. Well, that too led to a reaction partly in the direction of communism, and then in the direction of a revived political Shiism. And I think in 1979 there was a big conflict between these, and eventually the communists were defeated and probably mostly murdered. And the political Shiites won out. So it's a very similar movement there.
Professor Black, what the young Ottomans did with regards to first calling for modernization, which in effect turned out to be westernization.
Yes.
And then saying wanting rule of the people and applying the spirit of the Sharia and actually doing away with the Sharia, was this not nothing short of treachery to the actual original Islamic State?
Yeah.
And obviously a disservice to the fundamentals of all those scholars who said we needed Sharia in politics. Is this not short of this? I mean, what they've done is a big injustice to the Ummah, as we would say.
Yes, well, I don't know too much about the politics of sort of late 19th to early 20th century, but I would assume that Mustafa Kemal was basically an unbeliever, a secularist, and he just saw this as the best way forward. Now, where exactly the move away from the Sharia came from, I just don't know. But I think it just shows how war and events can sort of override what might have been a preferable way, which might have been the young Ottoman way. The young Ottomans were succeeded by the young Turks, and of course the other component here, which was nationalism. I mean, Turkey was and is ferociously nationalistic. Christians have been worse treated in modern Turkey than under the Ottoman Empire. There are no Christians left hardly in Turkey. If you raise your head above the parapet, well, I don't say you get killed, but you're very severely frowned upon. The whole area has, and look at the way they treat the Kurds. I mean, nationalism is the replacement, you know, as a social identity, so it's tragic, really. The same happened in Europe to some extent, of course, with Germany.
But in a way, he did away with religion then. There was no religious basis for what he did then. He was just
Oh, no, as far as I know, not. I mean, it was very much a nationalist thing, and the Turkish studies were the big thing, the identity of the Turkish people, and trying to recover the pre-Islamic Turkish stuff, and all of that was very, very big.
Yeah, it's fascinating listening about the Ottomans. I mean, I've once read an interesting statistic saying that only one Ottoman caliph actually performed the Hajj, and that was Sultan Selim. So they weren't very religious as a group, as a dynasty.
Yeah.
However, I often hear, I mean, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk is greatly reviled by many Muslims for doing away with the Khalifa and basically, he ended the Khilafah after how many years. But I think it's probably not that clear cut. I mean, could you make the case for Mustafa Kemal? I mean, I don't know. Is he misunderstood by Muslims in his context?
I'm afraid I don't know enough about him. I mean, my friend Sami Zubaydah, whom I mentioned, somebody pointed out to me many years ago. He said, you know, when the people in the Middle East look to the West, there are in fact many Wests. There's not only parliamentary liberalism, there's fascism. And that played a big part in Turkey. You know, there was a big move towards, in other words, an authoritarian state.
I mean, the reason why I say this is because in the end, Turkey didn't get occupied. Its territorial
No.
Yeah, and a lot of that was largely thanks to the war effort during the First World War.
Yes.
And Mustafa Kemal played a big part in
yes.
that. I mean, this stuff doesn't. I mean, it could have quite easily have been colonized and carved up like every other.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, at the end of the First World War, when the Ottoman collapsed, the Greeks thought they'd have a go, so they invaded Turkey. But Mustafa Kemal was there, and he drove them right back out of Turkey, and he was still advancing in, you know, the area of Macedonia, the old Ottoman Empire. It was the only power on the German-Austrian side in the First World War who made peace while they were still gaining territory. I mean, they were still gaining territory when they agreed to a peace with the Western Allies. So yes, he was very successful. But I mean, as Machiavelli pointed out, great military leaders don't always make great politicians. People have different skills.
I was wondering, do you know if, or in your opinion, the young Ottomans as opposed to the young Turks?
Sorry,
the young Ottomans,
yes,
as opposed to the young Turks. Were they basically primarily westernizers, but then using Islam to make their ideas appealing to the Turkish masses or the Ottoman masses? Or would you say they were actually genuinely religious Muslims, but westernizers at the same time? In a similar way, well, not a similar way, but I've got a second question if it's okay. In Iran, the revolution.
In Iran?
Iran, the revolution, what I heard is the way of the Ayatollahs, I don't know what that movement was called, but the people who took power ultimately. I heard this is actually divergent from traditional Shi'i political thought, which is basically you don't take over, you don't take power until the Mahdi, the Mahdi, or the Imam arrives. But I just wanted
okay. I'll go back to get to the microphone. Yes, well, on the first question, I don't know too much about them, but my feeling from reading what I've read is that they were perfectly sincere, and that they weren't trying to use the Islamic appeal as a way to get credibility. They genuinely thought what they said. I suspect that is the case. The second question, sorry, Iran.
Basically about
in Iran,
the Shiite. I mean.
Oh yes, they going away. Well, yes.
Did they take power on the basis of foreign ideas, or did they actually go back into Shi'i political form and say, we are
I think it's a very good example of how you can reinterpret a religion, because the early Shiites were anti-participation, quietist, and then, but beginning long before the 20th century, as I said, in the 16th, 17th century, they said no, political participation is permitted, indeed it is required, and you should be. But still, you're right, and I think what you're getting at, that today in the Shia community there is a strong continuation of the earlier tradition, which I think is based in Iraq, or certainly was, you know, who say, in fact, that big Ayatollah in Iraq, who was very, very old and died recently, I think, he was saying this is not, the way the Iranian Ayatollahs are going is not what they regard as true Shiism. So you're right, it's a division of opinion.
Can you just clarify, was the Shah of Iran, was he Sunni or Shia?
The Shah? Yeah. I would guess he was a Shiite, but the Shahs, incidentally, were trying to do what they did in Turkey. They were trying to secularize.
You have mentioned the whole time the Medinan Constitution, which strikes me as an example of an early political constitution right at the dawn of Islam, and you've not made any reference to it. I just wondered if you had anything to say about the constitution that's attributed to Muhammad at the time when he went to Medina and formed the alliance between himself and the Jewish tribes and the Bedouins. And the second question was a personal one. I just wondered what, if you'd like to say something about having spent all this time becoming an expert in Islamic political thought, what impact that had upon your own personal political and perhaps religious views,
right.
if any.
Well, two very penetrating questions in different ways. To be perfectly honest with you, I wrote that book, I started writing it 20 years ago, and that was when I worked on early Islam. And to be perfectly honest with you, I left out the Medinan Constitution, I think, because I thought its authenticity was in question. Now, whether it is in question and why, I am not certain. But that is why I think I omitted it. To answer the second question, to be perfectly honest with you, it didn't really make much impact. Maybe it should have done. The one exception to that, I have great respect for Al-Ghazali. I find his thinking extremely interesting, illuminating, and if one were to be a theist, I think he gives the best possible grounds for it, namely that you have to start somewhere. But this is, I mean, the reason it didn't make an impact is not that I'm indifferent, certainly to religion, or regard Islam as something less than important, but it is because I had by then spent half my life being a Christian and then ceasing to be a Christian, I think I regarded that as enough for one lifetime.
I wanted to know about this particular word, Islamism. When was it first used? Because my understanding of Islam, and perhaps anybody in the audience here can just explain, it's related to peace, although it means complete submission to the will of Allah. But here it's used along with fundamentalism. And to me, I feel that this is a Western concept, if you like, and perhaps some Muslims are certainly perpetuating that idea.
This is very important. People do impose concepts on other people, and this may be, I don't know when it was first used, but I take it to mean a belief that that Islam has at least some specifically Islamic political guidance or agenda, but it does cover an enormous variety. I mean, we know the current governing party in Turkey is Islamist, but it is moderate Islamist. It wants to reintroduce some of Islamic stuff into the public domain, but it doesn't go any further. But it might be more extreme and fundamentalist. That's why I see Islamist as a much broader term than fundamentalist. And whether fundamentalist is a satisfactory term, I have no idea. I mean, I can see problems with it, but...
Do you know when the word was first used?
No.
When did it come into circulation?
I don't. As far as I'm not aware of its being used very long ago. I think it came into being because people didn't like the term fundamentalism, I think.
Hi, I just had a question. There's been talk about how important the Reformation was in Christianity. And the question about whether Islam needed a similar type of reformation. So I don't know where your thoughts on that issue and where you stand.
Well, undoubtedly it was of enormous importance in Europe, and a lot of people like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani were advocating something similar, by which I think they meant departing from the current religious authorities, namely the established ulama and the current religious consensus, and going back to the original, which is, of course, what the European reformers, Protestants, did. So I think that's what is meant. And I suppose that has, to a large extent, happened, in that a lot of people, whether on the liberal side or on the fundamentalist side, do go back to the original sources and do bypass recent interpretations.
Yeah, but the Reformation of Christianity completely changed the political structure.
Yeah. Well, I guess you can't replicate these movements in a different situation. What happens among Muslims is unlikely to be the same, and what it'll be like, no one can say.
Professor Black, one of the main issues that seems to prop up many times over is the issue of women in society, especially in Muslim society. And it seems like any political arena that we enter into, we're always going to be called backwards because of the way we treat our women and the role of women being not equal. Now, my question is that, isn't it a bit hypocritical, really, or a bit of double standards from the West to say this when they've only just within the last century resolved this issue themselves? To say, like, Islamic, you can't go back to an Islamic ideal when really you should be following us, when this is an invention of recent times that there's equal rights between men and women, which there hasn't really been in the West for a majority of its history. Whereas if you look at the other model, which was the Islamic model, there are equal rights in the sense of what women require, what men require. I'm just thinking, like, it's become an issue now because of modern politics and the way the world is today. But it's a little bit, I don't know how to explain, in the sense that isn't it a little bit looking at things the wrong way around because of the situation now, to say the way the model of the previous, the Islamic civilization is wrong because it doesn't marry up to what we have now. I mean, surely the roles change with time anyway, don't they?
Yes. I would agree with what you're saying, yes. That it has only changed relatively recently in the West, yes.
You've talked about the impact of Western advancement on Islamic political thought, but you haven't mentioned the Renaissance at all, and the fact that it was actually caused by Islamic civilization. So what effect did that have on Islamic political thought? That's one point. And the other one is, you seem to be implying that it's only a secular state that can give gender equality and tolerance towards other faiths, when actually wasn't the Ottoman Empire the cause of was the basis on which the British constitution was set up in terms of tolerance towards other faiths?
Very interesting. Sorry, your first point was about the Renaissance. Yes. Well, I don't actually think the Renaissance. Well, I mean, there were Muslim influences, but I'm afraid they tend to be exaggerated by some commentators, and especially a lot of politically correct Western commentators tend to say, in an attempt to bend over backwards against people being anti-Muslim, you know, they tend to say it's all. I mean, some things came. A lot of poetry and music came. The troubadours. Some philosophical stuff came. A lot of texts came. But the Renaissance as a whole was owed to many other things. And I would say that the contribution of the Muslim contribution was relatively minor.
But wasn't the availability of information came through the translation?
Sorry, the inability to.
Surely the Renaissance happened because the Muslim empires were translating all the.
Well, actually, yeah, no. I mean, if you include, yes, if you include the act of translating texts and the preservation of texts in Spain, particularly, there is a great deal. Yeah, I see what you mean. No, there's a lot of truth in that. Sorry?
It was the Dark Ages. It was called the Dark Ages when Islam was going through its golden period. So that's something that needs to be kind of recognised, I think. When you
well, I think it has been recognised.
But you haven't mentioned that at all.
Haven't I? Well,
and you seem to be
I mean, certainly Europe developed philosophically after, roughly speaking, when philosophy declined in the Islamic world, it began in Europe, you know, so it was afterwards.
But there was a massive advancements in science.
Oh yes, there were, yeah, absolutely. In medicine, mathematics, some branches of the sciences, oh yes, yes, yeah. In political thought, I think the contribution was less, but it was, yeah. The other point was about.
Promulgating that you need to have a secular society to have.
Oh yes, okay. Well, the Ottomans. Yeah, I mean, again, if you go back in history, the Muslim societies and the Ottomans were more tolerant than the Christian in the Middle Ages up until the 18th century or the 17th. I mean, Christian states, so-called Christian states, only became tolerant after the Reformation. Really, I mean, they were, yes.
But you were towards the end that basically, you know,
there has to be secular.
To have secular governments to achieve this, when actually Islam was the, you know, set the example of what it can be. And I think you're judging Islam by the behaviour of Muslims rather than actually looking at the faith Islam itself, which is the ideal which we're supposed to follow.
Well, I mean, obviously you could have a state which was ruled by Muslims, which was entirely tolerant. But you'd have to have, I mean, to have toleration, you have to have a legal basis, and therefore you'd have to have, you know, the current legislation, Bill of Rights, or whatever you like to call it. But there's no reason why that shouldn't be done, I mean, by religious people. I mean, secular people can be extremely intolerant, as we know. So, I mean, I would agree with you to that extent.
But it's actually part of the faith, and it's something.
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
The Quran says there's no compulsion in religion.
Yeah, well, exactly, yeah, that's.
This is something that doesn't have to be secular, it's actually embodied in the
Okay. Well, I think what he means is a state that is not, doesn't incorporate religious, doesn't differentiate, doesn't favour people of any particular religion.
Yes.
So should we say a non-partisan state?
I think
doesn't have to be secular, I agree.
In the lands where Muslims were a majority, was the Islamic political thought any different from the lands where Muslims were a minority? So a very early period would be Abyssinia or Ethiopia. Even today, there's still a minority, but a large minority, and then there's other places around the world throughout history. I'm not so sure about the Ottoman Empire. Maybe for some part of the history, 50% of the people were not Muslim, non-Turkish. So, well, that's
right.
Yeah.
Well, the only difference I'm aware of would be nowadays yourselves, Muslims in the West, where I think political thought is somewhat different. Muslim political thought in the West is somewhat different.
With the British Empire.
Ah, well, if you're talking about traditionally Muslim countries, or in previous history, you mentioned Abyssinia, I don't know about that, but we'll take Spain, which I think probably had a majority of Christians and Jews, even though it was ruled by Muslims. I don't think it was particularly different, no. But then there wasn't a lot of political thought until Ibn Rushd, actually. I don't think. I think the answer basically is no. In the Ottoman Empire, I think what mattered was political control, actually.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation today. I wanted to see what your insight was as a historian, looking forward as opposed to looking back,
right?
And what you see going ahead in the coming decade or so, given such change at the moment.
Yeah. Well, basically, I think one just cannot make much in the way of predictions, and I would prefer not to. I suppose if I have a simple preference, it was one which I think I expressed to my friends last night, that I wish that everybody, Muslims and others, would stop bickering about what I personally regard as relatively minor issues and focus on the major issue facing humanity, which in my opinion is climate change. Until we solve that, the other thing, I mean, the survival of human beings is far more important, in my opinion, than almost anything else. And we should all focus on that. So transcend religious differences.
You mentioned earlier on before that part of the crisis of Islamic political thought was, I think you said, a disunity, and I think one of the major problems is that the Muslims never actually figured out how to get rid of a ruler that is unjust. So
yeah, that
and it comes back to the famous Karl Popper statement where he said, it's the wrong question to ask, how do you get the right person into office? Because often the mediocre people or the scum of society rise to the top and rule countries. It's common. Usually the wisest people are not attracted to political posts. So the question is how do you prevent them from causing as much harm and damage? Because if you look throughout the whole annals of Islamic history, we look back at the golden age of the four rightly guided caliphs, Umar bin Abdul Aziz, maybe Harun al-Rashid, a few other names, but most of the time it's mediocre sultans and rulers who kill each other to get fiefdoms, and then when another one comes to power, he kills his brother, his nephews, and then comes to power. If you read, so is this the big problem where the Islamic world didn't figure out how to get rid of an unjust ruler? Say,
yes,
no mechanism was in place to that.
I would entirely agree with that. And I mean, this is something which other people didn't know how to do either. I mean, the Europeans only got around to this, well, I suppose in Britain in about 1700, So it's a relatively recent development here too.
Are you planning another chapter for your book then about the Arab Spring, or is it too early to do something like that? And what about, I don't know if you would call him a philosopher, and perhaps he's not an appropriate person, but people like Tariq Ramadan talking about Muslims in Europe and that kind of thing?
Well, no, I'm not planning anything else at the moment. The Arab Spring, yes, well, who knows? I think...
Could it turn into what people call it a Islamist winter?
Well, I think to answer that question, the first qualification would be to be living in one of these countries. If one was an inhabitant of Egypt, one would have a better chance of answering that question.
That's for a future historian.
Yes, I think so.
Professor, with due respect, you left me with a very strong impression that you've been very soft on the impact of colonialism on the Muslim world. You mentioned Islamism, Maududi, and other factors without really recognizing that they are really in the category of response to colonialism. The gentleman was saying, Muslims don't know how to get rid of their rulers. I mean, if that is a historical analysis, that doesn't mean it should not happen now or in the future.
Yeah.
The Muslim countries you mentioned, colonialism has produced a class of people. Whole purpose in life was institutions, every education system to serve the empires at that time. And they have not gone away, they're still there. The corruption is the highest, and our media here, the West, everything overlooks that. Okay, and those rulers are in constrained position, for obvious reasons. The local people have to respond somehow, and if Islam tends to offer some hope, it obviously has this attraction. Okay, and I think, and for example, you said why the military rulers come up and rule countries like in Pakistan and elsewhere. The reason is defense. The countries are threatened, their security is threatened. So the military people take precedence because they're the only people. They don't have resources and they establish economies and so on. And similar things applies to the women's attitude towards the women. We tend to apply the criteria as if we're living in the suburbia and so on, without realizing. If you go to Afghanistan, they didn't have electricity until a few years ago. The roads, the education system, if those conditions existed here, what kind of people would they produce? And the rush to associate everything with Islam, whether it's towards attitudes to women and so on, I think in itself needs criticism and fair assessment.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair comment. Yeah.
And I think, for political reasons, as a post 9/11 response, a lot of things are automatically, connected with Islam on a very questionable basis. Briefly about Maulana Maududi, you quoted him with respect without looking at how his party behaved in practice. I have no close contact with him, obviously or his party, but my understanding is he and his party have always been pro-democracy. Against Ayyub, who was the dictator, that a military man, they supported a female leader, Jinnah's sister, against him. His party was supporter of Fatima Jinnah. So they always have been democratic party. They wanted to get to power through democratic means. And I think that fact has to be recognized. And to my knowledge, he never preached violence. In his movements, he says, orders, everything else within the law, very principled. Okay, fundamentalism is not the favor of the month, as it were. But I think these other aspects should be recognized and not demonized simply because, that's the way the press handles it, Another brief point that you were talking about, I think you said humbly influence and Wahhabism, and the Saudi government is a reflection of that. The problem I have with that is that there's no accountability on the part of these fiefdoms. They don't think they have to be accountable or transparent in how they manage. I don't know how many princes there are, it runs into thousands, and they have a right to this and that because some blood lineage or something. What place that has in Islam, I'm ignorant, I can't just connect the two. So I think I personally have a problem. Okay, they are the custodians of the Holy Mosque and they have done certain ritualistic things wonderfully, make it easy for people. But when you look at the essence, you go back to the gentleman mentioned, the Khilafat, there is accountability and transparency in terms of finance and people's rights and so on. The first welfare state in history was established by the second Khalifa. And the reports that the Cambridge guy here, when it was happening in Britain, was consulted about that because it was such detailed and so structured. Okay, and when you look at these other people, you mentioned an example, I do not see, and I think that's a failing. There's no transparency and there's no accountability. I think you want me to shut up, okay? You're very polite. I will, because you stifled me. There were so many points that you allowed me to. Okay, I think I've nearly finished. Oh yeah, final point very briefly. Your treatment of the Ottoman rule, not empire. I was corrected by a scholar from Turkey. You see, there's no mention ever or recognition of the fact that they established the longest rule, 600 years, probably in human history, which were diverse in terms of races that lived there, religion, languages, and so on, and all amicably in a very tolerant way, without having all these problems and revolutions and civil whatever, and they managed to do this fairly successfully. And when you were describing what was happening, the machinations that I thought was always happening in Istanbul, in Turkey, not out there, across the vast geographical area, where they had, somebody was telling me, at least 3,000 hospitals in major cities. Each city had a hospital, privately funded, on Islamic principles.
Are you talking about the Ottoman Empire?
I'm
or
talking about the
rule?
Yeah. These things are never recognized. It's all about the machinations of what happens in Turkey and so on. So they have a contribution to make. I didn't make, and that we should be recognized. Thank you, sir.
Well, I think one would need to study the social history of. I would consider the Balkans as being the most important example of what you're talking about as to what it was actually like to live there. Under Ottoman rule, I don't know. But why, in what sense the Ottoman Empire was not an empire, but the, the Roman Empire or the British Empire even was, I just don't understand, because this was a family ruling over people they'd conquered. That was quite simply it. There was no question of consent. What the people thought, we don't know. They were never asked. On your question about colonialism, I would just quote, I think he was called Said Khan, I'm not sure, but there was one famous Indian Muslim leader in the late 19th century who said, for God's sake, don't leave India. How do you think we Muslims and Hindus would manage if the British left? There'd be a Hindu majority and there'd be civil war. So
you don't want an answer to that, do you? Okay,
there was, I'm afraid. So, the end of colonialism, what I would criticize unquestionably is the way it was done.
Yeah,
and
that
was
managed without colonialism. You can't assume the history started.
Well, if you could, my answer to that, it may sound a bit.
Rule? Look at the Middle East.
Sorry?
Look at the Middle East. How many countries have mushroomed?
How many countries?
Yeah, after the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which I think Britain helped to create, all these little fiefdoms and God knows what,
Just
well,
respond to that question.
Okay. I think there the tragedy is the Peace of Versailles and the Western interventions after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. If they'd been able to sort it out on a more consensual basis, I'm sure it would have. I would entirely agree that the way the states were drawn up was pretty dysfunctional.
My question is going back to Ibn Taymiyyah you were talking about earlier. You gave us this impression that he was the first original Islamic thinker who kind of diffused the spirituality and politic in.
Sorry, could you speak up a bit?
Okay, he was the first original Islamic thinker who diffused both the spirituality and politics into one. The Siyasa Sharia, the Islamic governance. Obviously here he had quite strong ideas in terms of how Muslim society and Muslim state should be run. But you made a comment that today Saudi Arabia or Saudi state they claim, or sort of many think they are kind of representing the Hanbali Wahhabi sort of school of thought. And I think many of us, I certainly can speak for myself, I have a problem with what they represent, but I don't want to criticize them too much because I would need a visa at some stage to go for Hajj and stuff. But my point is, do you reckon, how does it, my real point is, we know the Sayyid Qutb's views. He's saying, look, it doesn't matter what kind of, how we came to power, as long as the governance is by Sharia, that's what matters. So my question that really goes back to originally what the lady over there was asking. What is the legitimate mechanism in terms of acquiring power? What does Imam Ibn Taymiyyah has to say about this? And what let's say, how does it fit into today's Saudi Arabia in terms of hereditary passing on power?
Well, I think this is a gap in traditional Islamic political thought, that they don't have a means there's no stipulated means. Well, I mean, Christian political, I mean, here, let me make a distinction between Christian and Western. Christian political thought, as you know, also has no, well, actually they did have various things, but I mean, means developed, whether they were due to Christianity or to other factors, nobody could easily say. It does seem to me that traditional Islamic political does not stipulate a means of getting rid of a bad ruler. And that is certainly a problem. But I mean, there's no reason why you as Muslims shouldn't come up and say, well, it's obvious that what we should do is so and so and so and so, and that's it. And I mean, this is what Muhammad would have done if he'd been around in this situation. You could perfectly well, I'd have thought, say that, and that's it. I mean, just because it isn't in the Quran doesn't mean, obviously, it doesn't mean you can't do it, because the situation wasn't faced, wasn't addressed, just as it wasn't in the New Testament.
You mentioned Taha and An-Naim, but there are some.
Sorry?
You mentioned Taha and An-Naim,
Yes.
the recent one, and there is some Turkish scholar. One of them I know is Mustafa Akol, and he wrote a book about Islam without extremes. I don't know if you are familiar with any of his ideas.
I haven't come across that. But
I
yes,
think
I'm sure
it's very similar to what you
yeah,
mentioned.
Right,
Thank you.
yes.
Final few questions.
I mean, I do think there is scope for writing about things today by one of you or some of you, you know what I mean, that you will be far more familiar with the great variety and the nuances of opinion than somebody like I am, probably. So, I mean, you should do it. Good subject for a PhD subject.
Hi. I imagine you ducked this question, but since the caliphate was abolished in 1924 by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the idea of the caliphate for a lot of Muslims is still a dream or an ideal.
Yes, yes.
And it won't go away, I don't think.
No.
And I mean, in the future, how would you envisage a future caliphate?
Oh.
I mean.
I couldn't. I mean, it's not for me to say. That's for you to say.
It's adding on to there is actually a book that's launched saying the emergence of I mean, this has been quoted by American diplomats. They're preparing themselves, the CIA and all the agencies around the world. They're accepted. Look, there's going to be a unified Muslim entity. We have to deal with it.
Oh, I see.
That's
right,
what
yes.
There are many. I mean, what he's trying to say, and I've seen it amongst some political scientists. The argument is now amongst political scientists is how do we deal with a unified Muslim entity? So it could be a caliphate or whatever. Yeah. What are your thoughts with regards to that as a political historian?
Well, I mean, not being a Muslim, I don't see having a unified Muslim entity as having any particular advantages. I mean, if it's a good idea from a religious point of view, so be it. But for me, the most important thing is to try and do something more effective with the United Nations. And I think this is what will decide the future of the world much more, to get China and America to have a means of dialogue. And there again, you have great problems. I mean, Western democracy, which I certainly wouldn't hold up as having the answers to many questions. And clearly, the democratic process in America at this moment is very problematic, and it's throwing up all sorts of possibilities for conflict with China, you know. I mean, you appeal to the masses by saying, typical way of appealing to the masses, by holding up a bogeyman outside and saying, these people are bad, therefore elect me to deal with them. This is very problematic.
To what extent, how do you think the increase, the clear increase in Islamophobia globally?
How do I see the increase in
Islamophobia globally, institutionally, culturally, and on the ground? Does that reflect the limits of toleration of the conception of the human in Western political theory? That, I mean, the human was never equal in Western political theory. The American Constitution is only for white males of Christian origin, primarily. And that was obviously changed only about 40 years ago, actually on the ground by struggle and conflict. So is it not the case that Islamic political theory throughout history and in contemporary times represents the only points of view
that presents the human in a universal fashion, looking at their increase of Islamophobia, and does this not demonstrate the limits of toleration of Western political theory as it's practiced?
Right. Well, I don't agree with your statement about Islamic political thought being the only one that is any good, but about Islamophobia. Well, there is a lot of it around. I agree, worldwide. There is, yes, and it's deplorable. I know, but people indulge in these collective fantasies, don't they? They fantasize about the other. It's a problem with human beings.
How can you be
We're inadequately evolved. Well, I think the answer to most of these problems, you know, is proper education, better education. People need to be educated about what things are like and what other people are like, and taught in the right way. I mean, this, I think, the only way, for example, in Britain, where I think one of the major problems is the gutter press, like Fox News in America and The Sun in Britain, for example. The second worst man in modern history after Adolf Hitler, in my opinion, was, what's his name, who runs all these newspapers? Rupert Murdoch, exactly. Yes, the second worst, well, second worst, yes. Worse than Stalin, I would say. Really. Well, for the effect he's had, the only way to avoid the influence of Fox News and The Sun is to have people properly educated, because properly educated people, you only need to educate them to the age of 16, but if you had proper classes in what you call social and moral education, you know, people wouldn't be so susceptible. They'd be told, look, if you read something, check it. Get the alternative point of view. Very simple. Children, you know, babies practically, but certainly very young children, are always asking questions. Why? And if they were encouraged to do that and kept doing that, you know, you must always look at another point of view. That may not be right. You know, all you have to build on human instinct.
Yeah, this has been alluded to before, but I just thought I'd state it explicitly. We've just finished the talk on political theory, but I really wanted to ask a question as to how much of an impact politics has actually made in the world, and whether there's other things like the social factors and other things which are far more important. Because I think there's a tendency in history just to look at the caliph as opposed to the various other things.
Absolutely. Oh yes.
And I just thought I'd just state that.
Well, I agree. I mean, they're all important. Yes.
Professor Black, as a historian, obviously studied the lifespan of civilizations, and one of the things you're mentioning is here the Muslims want the revival back, the Islamic civilization to come back again. But is it not a case that now is the time for the West, in the sense that they're in their moment, and it's a case of waiting for the Western civilization to fall before the Islamic civilization can rise, because of the gap that there is between them? I mean, from a historian point of view, is this what is basically inevitable, rather than the case of trying to compete with the West at the moment, because they're in a league of their own?
Well, I think the West is in serious difficulty economically, which is always a presage to other kinds of difficulty. If there was, I mean, if I was to make a prediction, which I wouldn't, it would be that the rising star is China, and that it is rising and it will go on rising, but it may not. But I think that is entirely possible, which is neither Western nor Islamic, but Chinese. That's just a point of view.